Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, after months of negotiations, Israel and Hamas agreed to a phased ceasefire and hostage release deal in Gaza, which it's hoped will put an end to what's been 15 months of fighting in the Palestinian territory. But less than 24 hours after that ceasefire deal was struck, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was accusing Hamas of reneging on parts of the agreement, saying that they're trying to, quote, extort last-minute concessions. Well, this deal will allow for a surge in humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza, which age groups say is needed urgently. Coming up, we'll ask a spokesperson from UNICEF how this has affected children in the enclave. And drawing a line under a political career that spanned half a century, the outgoing US President Joe Biden delivers a farewell speech from the Oval Office in which he warns of the dangers that lie ahead for the United States. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the latest on the ceasefire deal that was struck last night between Israel and Hamas. All these past 15 months of war, just to remind you, was sparked by the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October 2023, the deadliest ever attack on Israel, which resulted in the deaths of 1,210 people. Well, Palestinian militants also took 250 people hostage on that deadly day. 94 of them are still being held in Gaza, though the Israeli military says that of them, 34 are believed to be dead. Well, Israel's retaliatory campaign in Gaza has resulted in the deaths of more than 46,000 people, the majority of them believed to be civilians. Well, after months of intense diplomatic efforts, Israel and Hamas have now reached a ceasefire deal, which is due to take effect on the 19th of January. Well, this deal will also include an exchange of hostages and prisoners. Well, for the latest, we can speak now to journalist Noga Tarnopolsky, who joins us from Jerusalem. Noga, great to have you with us. Israel accusing Hamas of backtracking on parts of this ceasefire and hostage release deal already. Of course, this truce is due to take effect on Sunday. I mean, is it in serious jeopardy at this stage?
I think it's basically a done deal. I think we're seeing some internal Jerusalem maneuvering here with the Prime Minister Netanyahu trying to kind of kick the can down till tomorrow if he can push a cabinet vote. Till then, trying to shore up some of his more recalcitrant ministers, and also by accusing Hamas of trying to blackmail Israel at the last moment. Absent any other evidence that that's happening, he appears to be trying to convince his base that, in fact, he is fighting for them down to the wire. But I don't have the impression that the agreement is actually in danger right now.
And when Israel says Hamas is trying to extort the negotiators with some last-minute concessions, I mean, do we have any idea as to what all of this relates to?
Not really. One of the Prime Minister's statements implied that it had something to do with the Philadelphia corridor, which is the name for the border between Gaza and Egypt. It seems unclear. It seems to me like it's more kind of maneuvering. That said, Netanyahu is in a bit of a pickle because this is supposed to be a three-phase deal. So right now, it does appear that he will have the votes in cabinet, which he needs under law, to ratify this. So he does have the votes to pass the first phase. The second phase is supposed to enter into negotiations on day 16 of the first phase. He absolutely does not have the votes in cabinet to pass the second phase, which would have more far-reaching effects, including the complete and total withdrawal of all of any aspects of the Israeli army from the entire Gaza Strip. So I think he's also trying to kind of reposition himself ahead of that new negotiation, which is going to be even tougher for him.
What was the reaction like, Noga, last night when the news emerged that after all of these, down-to-the-wire talks and lots of false starts and lots of perhaps misguided optimism over previous months, that finally a deal had been struck? How did people respond to that?
It was a very ambiguous and complicated response on the Israeli side. There's a lot of heartbreak. There is deep pain over the fact that this deal was on the table way back in May, and so many lives could have been saved in the interim, including those 6 hostages who were executed on September 1 or August 30th, including the American Hirsch Goldberg Polin, and many soldiers whose parents now in public are claiming that their children are dying in vain. These are very young conscripted soldiers who've made no choice to participate in this. There's also a lot of fear in Israel that the government will not follow through with phase 2, and thus 2/3 of the remaining hostages could be, relegated to an unknown future in Gaza. There's also, I would say, something between confusion and anger over the fact that it appears to have taken 2 American presidents to come to this deal that was on the table back in May, whereas the Israeli prime minister, who could have gone for it or made a real effort for it all along, seems almost a passive figure in the entire international stage. So a very complex response on the Israeli side.
And when it comes to apportioning credit, obviously lots of parties were involved in the talks: Qatar, Egypt, the United States, obviously Israel, obviously delegations from Hamas. But who does the average person in the street in Israel think deserves the credit for arriving at this point?
My sense is that right now Israelis are so kind of fearful and heartbroken that no one is going to get any credit in the Israeli heart until at least some hostages are seen coming home. I think it's too early for that. But what you do see among Israeli media, kind of macho media commentarists, is a lot of credit being given to Donald Trump. And I'm quoting now the senior diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz, who said, frankly, that it took Donald Trump strong-arming Netanyahu to get this deal done. I think too little credit is being given to Joe Biden, who spent months and months advancing this, and whose team, in fact, did write up the entire accord, which is finally going to be implemented.
And of course, people on the far right of the political spectrum in Israel have been particularly vocal in opposing this deal. They have described it as variously dangerous and disastrous. I mean, what sorts of levels of support do those kinds of arguments have?
There's a lot of doubt about this accord across the board in Israeli society, but most of those doubts don't come from that extreme right that you're mentioning. The extreme right has a very loud, very threatening minority of the Israeli public, but it happens to be that part of the Israeli public that voted in the most extremist parties of this government. So they have power over these ministers, and they may have some influence over tomorrow's vote, assuming the cabinet does convene, simply because they're the base that voted them in. The fact remains, it's a very small minority. It's less than 20% of Israelis who have those kind of harbor that ultra right-wing nationalist theocratic opposition to this deal. But I would emphasize, across the board, secular Israelis whose children go to the army, all sorts of families who have hostages in Gaza, most people seem to feel trepidation ahead of the implementation of this deal.
And just lastly, I'm just wondering what sort of a figure Prime Minister Netanyahu cut at this stage, because in recent months he's had lots of foreign policy and foreign affairs coups, we could call them, successes in various parts of the world, including severely degrading Hezbollah in Lebanon. We've seen the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, although I'm not sure even Benjamin Netanyahu claims much credit for that. But a lot of things have changed. And I'm just wondering, all of these things viewed together, does Benjamin Netanyahu cut a stronger or a weaker figure than he did 15 months ago when the October 7th attacks took place?
He was a weak and unpopular prime minister before the war began. That was as a result of his effort to enact a sort of regime change, an anti-democratic regime change in Israel. Since the war has started, he has consistently gotten less and less popular. He's a very weak prime minister right now. He's very unpopular. He's also a very absent prime minister. You know, it's remarkable that the Qatari and the Americans and all of these leaders have spoken out about this. Even the Catholic Church put out a statement welcoming this agreement. Israeli leadership hasn't been heard from at all. Netanyahu seems to have been hunkered up somewhere. It's unclear if he doesn't dare face the Israeli public or he doesn't know what to say. What we do see is a weak and fractured government led by an unpopular prime minister, and he's trying right now to play it both ways. Israelis absolutely do see the fact that he's trying to tell the Americans one thing, tell Donald Trump, yes, we're going to see this deal through, and tell his own ministers, don't worry, we're not going to go beyond phase one. And that is not, I would say, sitting very well with the Israeli public right now.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Journalist Noga
Great
Tarnopolsky.
talking with you, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Well, let's get some more analysis now on this ceasefire deal, and we can speak to Dr. Sarah Hussaini, who is the director of the British Palestinian Committee. Thank you so much for joining us from the UK, Dr. Hussaini. I'd just like to get your reaction. What went through your mind when you heard that the deal had finally, after months of waiting, been struck between the two sides?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of emotions, I think, is probably the answer to that. And as you said, after 15 months of really relentless assault on our family and friends and loved ones, colleagues in Gaza, the reaction was that obviously this is both an imperative thing to have happened, but long, long overdue. It should have happened 15 months ago. I think initially there's a sense of relief of all of us Palestinians everywhere in the world, particularly for those in Gaza. So the doctors and the nurses, for example, who have continued to treat patients while Israeli tanks have been invading hospitals and destroying them. Teachers and academics who, despite the systematic destruction of the education system, as you'll know, all 12 of Gaza's higher education institutions have been bombed to pieces, but the teachers and the academics are still teaching and the students are still taking vivas and things intense. And, thinking about the rescue workers as well, who have risked their own lives to try and save people buried under the rubble after bombardment. And, now we're faced with 42 million tons of rubble that the UN thinks is going to take about 15 years to clear. So there's a sort of a relief mixed with grief. And then, of course, a deep sense of unease and a deep will, we don't want to be naive and we don't want to be short-sighted about this. This is not the first time Gaza's been attacked. It's not the first ceasefire. Israel spent decades carrying out its agenda of ethnic cleansing, its expansionist agenda to dispossess Palestinians from their homes. And the last 15 months has really just shown the world how far it's willing to go, and also how far it's able to go with impunity from the international community. And among those, I class the UK government as being primary in terms of not only failing to uphold its duties to Palestinians, not only failing to hold Israel to account, but actually enabling this genocidal assault by continuing to provide, together with the US, billions of dollars of weapons, military support, diplomatic support, and so on.
Okay, well, I'm going to pick up on some of those points in just a moment, but I just want to ask you what you thought when you heard a little earlier on today that we had, these reports of Israel accusing Hamas of backtracking on parts of the deal already. I mean, the deal hasn't even taken effect already, and yet we've got Israel saying that Hamas was trying to, quote, extort last-minute concessions. We were just talking to our correspondent, a correspondent in Jerusalem about this a little earlier on. She didn't seem to think it was necessarily meaning that the deal was in jeopardy as such, perhaps a bump in the road or perhaps a bit of show. What's your reading of it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not in the room, obviously, as you aren't either. But what I think I think all we can go on really is, first of all, the fact that we know that there will be spin around this, and second of all, that we have to look at the track record. And I think it's worth pointing out, this agreement is almost word for word an agreement that was rejected by Israel, according to the mediators, back in May of 2024. And just thinking about the unimaginable devastation that's happened since then at the hands of Israeli forces, but to say that, there's a track record here. Israel has relayed on ceasefires in the past. We have, phased withdrawals, which is a big part of this deal, is something that always raises concern and worry amongst Palestinians. The case in point being the Oslo Accords of the 90s, whereby Israel was supposed to have withdrawn from all of the occupied territories of Gaza and across Palestine. by 1999. You see where we are today. So I think we have to really take these things until we have concrete, facts. I think we have to look at the track record of what's happened in the past here.
Yeah, and what's so unprecedented about these latest talks and the round of talks that resulted in the deal that we now have is that you had two US administrations working side by side on that. And that's really quite unprecedented, isn't it? I'm just wondering how decisive you think it was to have the outgoing Biden administration sitting alongside the incoming Trump administration and, ultimately delivering the goods.
I mean, it's difficult to say because both administrations have been culpable of, as I said before, supporting, effectively aiding and abetting this genocide by continuing to provide military support, millions of dollars of military support. When Trump was in office the last time around, he approved the annexation of the Golan Heights and other areas. So it's difficult to say. So far, we've seen no signs of the US or indeed anyone holding Israel to account. So yeah, I'm not sure how significant it will be.
So who gets the credit then? We had all these different parties negotiating for months. In Qatar, there were the Egyptians present, the Qataris obviously, there were representatives of Hamas, Israel, and the United States. Who, therefore, do you think gets the credit for having delivered the ceasefire deal?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, Tom. I'm not sure it's about credit. I think it's about this is something that is, looking at the devastation that this has caused. I think it's about what happens next and what happens in the future. So it's going to be the credit will go to whoever can hold this agreement down and whoever can do what's necessary. Now, what we have noticed, what we have realised from this past 15 months, which we should have already known, is that there can be no military solution to this issue. So, early on, Netanyahu and Israeli leaders claimed to eliminate everything, planned total, destruction of the Gaza Strip, and it hasn't happened 15 months later. And I think that's really important because it just goes again to show that this will not be solved militarily. This needs a political solution, and the political solution has to begin with accountability. It has to begin with respect for international law and implementing, the dozens and dozens of international legal opinions and frameworks that are already in place. We know Israel's leaders have arrest warrants out against them. There's a trial for genocide at the ICJ against Israel. So there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of ways that countries like the UK, like the US could apply, like Egypt, could apply pressure, whether that's through sanctions, a 2A arms embargo, that would then actually get us towards some kind of long-term solution. Because again, we know this didn't begin 15 months ago. This is a part of a decades-long project of ethnic cleansing, of occupation, of siege. And so we can't be naive and we can't be short-sighted and we can't have a short memory on this.
Sure, and I should just point out that my question about credit really stemmed from the comments that were being made by the incoming president and the outgoing president, both of them claiming credit for having achieved this deal. I'd just like to ask you what you think Hamas's role is going to be moving forward. I mean, do you see Hamas having some sort of involvement in the governance of Gaza, or do you think that's something that the authorities in Ramallah are going to have to take care of?
I think that's a question for the Palestinian people as a whole, rather than just an individual. I think what I will say is that self-determination is an inalienable right, and it's something that has to absolutely be fulfilled if there's going to be any future that is a peaceful one. And so any initiative going forward, any form of rule, anything has to centre the Palestinian people as a whole. And everybody and all governments who are involved in this should be actively rejecting any initiative that seeks to bypass Palestinian civil society in some way. So, I spoke about the universities before. The universities might be destroy the buildings, but the professors, the institutions are still there, and they need to be strengthened and need to rebuild the education system as one example. So I think, going forward, what needs to happen really is that we need to make sure that there's urgent accountability, and that whatever solution in the future is there is something that centres Palestinians and doesn't bypass them, which we've seen time and time again in the past and has not worked.
And what is your feeling about the level of support for Hamas amongst Palestinian people, not just in Gaza, but in all Palestinian communities? Do you think there is a sense of they've done something quite extraordinary, which was to maintain 15 months of, they survived 15 months of bombardment, intense bombardment by Israel. I mean, obviously they're going to be framing this as being something of a victory, that they're severely weakened but not destroyed. But what do you think the people of Gaza, for example, think of Hamas now?
Yeah, I think the people of Gaza are concerned with trying to stay alive in this last few days before the ceasefire comes into being. I think, have just demonstrated, and again, this war by Israel has been against the entire population of the Gaza Strip and across Palestine. There've been, a number of attacks and Palestinians, like 7,000 or so Palestinians killed in the West Bank in the same time. So I think we have to really think about this as an attack on the Palestinian people as a whole, and look at the courage and the civic commitment that we've seen from Palestinians in Gaza as a whole. This is something that has their steadfastness as a whole has really inspired the world. And I think it's so important that we now do everything in our power from the outside to ensure that they don't have to go through this again, because this is the 6th time now since 2008 that Gaza's been bombarded.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Dr. Sarah Hussaini, Director of the British Palestinian Committee. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We can get some more analysis now from Professor Kamel Hawwash, Palestinian academic, writer and analyst, who joins us from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'd just like to get your first reaction, really, to the news of this deal between Israel and Hamas. Is it a good deal?
Well, there have been so many false starts. We've been hopeful that a deal would be struck, and so I welcome this particular deal because it will bring relief, hopefully, to the people of Gaza, who have been subjected to the most barbaric, atrocious attack by Israel, and who still face, even though securing the deal and the guns stopping would be fantastic, their future remains uncertain because there's been so much destruction. Many of them will not have homes to go back to. And of course, it will also involve the release of hostages, which everybody wants to see, and some Palestinian hostages in Israeli prisons who have been there without any judgment, and therefore Israel is holding them effectively as hostages.
Indeed. And, we saw months and months of false starts, what looked like pretty fruitless negotiations. To what do you attribute the fact that this deal was finally struck yesterday? What did it?
I think we have to acknowledge that the fact that President Trump, or President-elect Trump, will be coming to office on Monday, he had made a pretty clear message, as he does, that if there was no deal, if the hostages were not released, there would be, all hell to pay for in the Middle East. So that focused the minds. I also think his representative was apparently pretty tough with the Israelis, telling them this had to be agreed, because this is effectively the same deal that that was on the table back in May, that Joe Biden sort of took pride in formulating, which Hamas accepted then. But it was the Israelis who prevaricated, and Netanyahu continued to add more and more conditions. So it could have been struck earlier than this. It will not bring, as far as we know, the release of all Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails, but the release of all the hostages. But this is a good start in that sense.
Indeed. And I mean, it's hard to believe there's much left of Hamas after 15 months of devastating and highly concentrated bombardment of a very small territory, geographically speaking. How weak is Hamas? And when you consider the high-profile killings of high-profile individuals in that organization, what's left of Hamas?
It's difficult to judge, apart from the people who we know have been killed, i.e. Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh. What is left of Hamas, because Israel doesn't come forward with figures to say that they have killed so many fighters. In fact, they don't even acknowledge. They will just say that the figures that are produced from Gaza include those who've been killed from Hamas. But it's very difficult to judge how many there are. What we hear from people on the ground is that, in fact, because of the severity of Israel's attack on Gaza and the fact that many young men have lost most of their families, if not all of them, that more have been recruited, which makes, begs the question, what happens after the guns fall silent and all of this stops? So therefore, there is, whether you look at Hamas or not, the Palestinians have to come together to provide a united leadership that will rule over both Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, because that is the way that, the international community will have confidence in the rebuilding of Gaza, and that the push towards a solution, what majority of the world believes is the two-state solution, is so important now to, first of all, for the Palestinians to attain their rights of dignity, freedom, justice, and equality, but that also there would be no need for any fighting in the future between the two sides. However, we know for certain that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Knesset, and therefore Ben-Gvir and Smotrich's ministers are against the Palestinian state. So there's a lot of hard work to be done, and the world must take action to say to Israel, enough is enough. Yes, what happened on the 7th of October was a severe attack on Israelis, but for there to be peace in the future, there has to be recognition of Palestinians' rights, and that they should have freedom, justice, and equality, and a state of their own. I also think that Israel should be made to pay for the destruction that it has caused in Gaza, because so much of it was unnecessary. It was deliberate to try and push the Palestinians out, and therefore accountability would say that the International Criminal Court should have Netanyahu and Gallant brought to it, because there are warrants issued for them, and indeed for any people on the Palestinian side that it is chasing. So all of these go hand in hand. There has to be accountability. There has to be a push for peace. And it won't be just nice words that will bring a Palestinian state. There has to be action by the international community, starting with the United States, but also the UK, where I am as well, actually recognizing a Palestinian state and pushing for there to be reality on the ground of the Palestinians being free in their homeland.
You mentioned Donald Trump at the start of your previous answer, saying he has to be credited with having got the two sides together and that he'd been tough on both sides. Do you see him carrying on in that same vein? And if he does, do you see him being able to bring about the creation of a Palestinian state? I mean, is there a sense amongst Palestinians that he's also on their side?
I mean, in his previous tenure, he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, moved the American embassy, recognized the Golan Heights, the illegally occupied Golan Heights, as part of Israel. And he produced a peace plan that the Palestinians could not accept. So on that, you would think things will not be moving in a positive direction. But he's a disruptor. We know that you would be surprised as to the things he comes up with. For example, that he wants the Greenland to become part of the United States. Who would have thought that? How many people had heard of Greenland? But he's that kind of person. One of the difficulties, I think, will be that he's surrounding himself in his administration with pretty Zionist people, including the person he suggested as Secretary of State, and the American ambassador, the proposed American ambassador. For example, the ambassador says there's no West Bank, it's Judea and Samaria. So he's basically saying that Israel exists over the whole of historic Palestine. Now, what needs to happen is for Trump to say that's not going to bring peace. Israel must stop building settlements, must vacate the settlements, take its people out of Palestinian land for there to be a proper state. And what they would find is that the Palestinians on their side, that's what they want. They're not born to want to fight another people. They just want to live in their homeland in dignity, freedom, and independence. So if he can begin to bring that about, I think he would do the whole region a really great service. And that will also contribute to what the Americans want, which is to bring Saudi Arabia into the normalization process. If that doesn't happen, I doubt if Saudis will come along, and we'll continue to have tensions for quite a bit of time to come.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, though. Professor Kamel Hawwash, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for having me.
Well, less than 24 hours after the ceasefire deal was announced, Israeli forces are reported to have killed at least 82 people in Gaza. That's according to medical sources. Meanwhile, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called for a major boost in aid to alleviate what he called the immense suffering of the Palestinian people, although he did welcome the news of this truce. Well, for more, we can speak now to Tess Ingram, a spokesperson for UNICEF, who joins us from the Jordanian capital, Amman. Tess, great to have you with us. I'd just like to start by asking for your reaction to the news of this deal, and if you can tell us what it's going to mean for the humanitarian efforts there in Gaza.
Our immediate reaction is relief and hope. This is something that we've been calling for almost 15 months now. So we're certainly heartened by the news that this could come into action. But of course, it needs to be implemented and it needs to be sustained. And beyond that, we need the enabling conditions on the ground to ensure that our work as a humanitarian aid agency is enabled, because there's still so many challenges that remain. There's obviously an enormous humanitarian catastrophe for children on the ground. And while the news of the ceasefire means that children might no longer be from threat of bombs and bullets, a child with malnutrition needs the aid. And for us, that requires really scaling up and circumnavigating the really intense challenges that we've faced in the Gaza Strip with aid delivery since the very beginning of this conflict.
The Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, says that humanitarian aid is urgently needed there in Gaza. Just tell us a bit more about the situation, because I'm assuming it varies pretty considerably from one area to another.
That's right. I think that throughout all of the Gaza Strip, aid is desperately needed. The situation, of course, has been most acute in the north of the Gaza Strip, where access from humanitarian aid agencies like UNICEF has been incredibly restricted, and the people there have not got as much aid. But of course, everybody in Gaza needs the basics, which is horrific after 15 months that we're still talking about meeting people's basic needs: food, water, shelter, medicines, clothes. But that's where we're at. And I think when we think about the scale of the crisis, it's helpful to put it in the terms of real children. You know, we've seen repeatedly children dying from malnutrition, children languishing in hospital with wounds that can't be treated because there's not enough medicine, children being crushed in line for flour, children being injured, losing limbs. So there's so many physical and emotional scars now in Gaza, and the job ahead is, one, to stem the bleeding, and then two, try and get in and do whatever we can to help people.
Yeah, it's often said, and I'd just like to get your take on this, that it's children that bear the brunt of wars in general, not just this one, but other ones. Is that something you've seen? And maybe you can give us an example of why that's said.
We've said since the beginning of this conflict that Gaza is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child, and that children are bearing the brunt of this conflict. And that's because children are uniquely vulnerable to wars. They're uniquely vulnerable to explosive weapons, particularly when they're set off in populated areas, because by nature, children are often outside playing and they're smaller than adults, so they're more in line of fire. children are more vulnerable to malnutrition, to dehydration, to hypothermia. And of course, just in the last few weeks, there were reports of 8 babies dying of hypothermia in the Gaza Strip. So children really do bear the brunt of war. That's not an exaggeration. And in the Gaza Strip, where 50% of the population are children, every second person in the Gaza Strip is a child, I think that's something worth us remembering.
Yeah, we were just saying before we crossed to you that there's been yet more violence. I mean, the deal may have been agreed thousands of kilometers away, but on the ground, that hasn't translated yet into peace. And I'm just assuming that for your colleagues, your UNICEF colleagues, working in conditions like this are incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous for them, and it continues to be dangerous. So how much of a difference is it going to mean when the fighting actually stops?
It is the most dangerous place in the world to be a humanitarian. I was in a convoy in Gaza in April that was shot at, and many of my other colleagues have experienced similar situations or worse. We've lost so many humanitarian colleagues in Gaza over the last 15 months. So it is really dangerous, not just for us, but of course for the people that we're there to serve. The hope is that a ceasefire remedies that, at least from the sky, and that we can get on with the work. But it doesn't solve all of the security challenges that we face. Of course, there are unexploded ordinances now scattered across Gaza, and there is insecurity in the fact of criminal gangs who are relentlessly searching for aid that they can loot, including from our trucks. And that poses a threat to our staff and to the people that we're distributing the aid to.
And in terms of the aid getting through, the Rafah border crossing from Egypt's been closed for quite some time now. Do you think that's going to reopen soon? And how much of a difference will that make?
It would make a great difference if we can get that crossing open. We're really calling for all available crossings to be open so that we can flood the Gaza Strip with aid. We need to make sure that we're getting aid in from the north, from the south, and then that aid crosses Gaza so that we're really making sure that everybody is reached. But of course, this has not happened since the beginning of the war. So it remains a challenge, and it remains to be seen whether we're going to be able to do that. So we really are calling for all of these crossings to be open, for all of these access restrictions to be lifted, and for these challenges that we face inside the Gaza Strip, unexploded ordinances, criminal activity, to be remedied so that we have the best chance of serving the people of Gaza and providing them with the aid that they so desperately need.
One of the big challenges looking forwards is going to be what happens to the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, because there's a ban on that agency that's due to take effect later on this month. I don't know what you think is going to happen with regards to that ban and what you think the future of that agency is going to be.
I wish I had a crystal ball. I don't know. All I can say is that UNRWA is integral to the humanitarian operations in the Gaza Strip. And as we approach this ceasefire, removing UNRWA would be catastrophic. You can't take the backbone out of something and then expect it to function properly. And that's what we're facing if UNRWA is removed from operations in Palestine, including in Gaza. They really are the ones that have the most staff on the ground, really coordinate a lot of the response and provide services that no other UN agency can do. So we've been saying for months now that UNRWA is irreplaceable in Gaza, and that's a fact that without UNRWA, the entire humanitarian system would really struggle. So that's a threat that looms over us, particularly worrisome with the ceasefire ahead.
Yeah, and after what's been 400 days of displacement and starvation, clearly thousands of people want to return to their homes, which is a completely normal wish after being displaced all over the territory these last 15 months. But what percentage of those people are actually going to have a home to go back to? I know you don't have an exact number, but what sorts of numbers do you think do have a home to go back to?
I think that there's a lot of people who are hoping that their homes are still standing, but even more people who know that their homes are not. I've actually been talking to friends and colleagues in Gaza since the ceasefire was announced last night. And it's one of the things that continues to be repeated by people, that they're happy, they're relieved that this might occur, but they have nowhere to go. They have no home to return to. And so I think, Yes, we're going to see population movement as people try and go back to their communities or try and see what still stands and remains. But for a lot of people, they are now without a home. And that's going to be a really important part of the humanitarian response. I think we're talking potentially about hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, we're also talking about tens of billions of dollars to reconstruct Gaza after all of this. I mean, what sort of a bill could we be looking at here, and where's the money going to come from?
I think the international community obviously really needs to step up. This is something that UNICEF is not shying away from. We're going to be here every step of the way, meeting those basic needs at the outset, like I explained, but then staying with the children of Gaza every step of the way to help them rebuild. For example, more than 85% of schools are damaged or destroyed, 85%. So if we want to get children back into a classroom, we need to start rebuilding. So initially we're going to be having temporary learning spaces where children can go to learn, but then we need to start looking at schools. We need to start looking at how we get those classrooms back up and running again. And that's going to require an enormous amount of time and energy and resources and money. I can't put a dollar figure on it just yet, but it's going to be a big job, and hopefully the international community will be behind it.
Yeah, we've just heard that the EU is going to be giving 120 million euros in aid for Gaza, and as you say, other powers might follow suit. But just to sort of sum up, really, what are going to be UNICEF's top priorities in the immediate term now?
So right away, what we want to do is bring in nutrition supplies to treat malnourished children. We want to bring in vaccines to make sure that children are immunised against the diseases that continue to threaten them, and medicines to help treat children who've got illnesses. We also want to bring in items for the temporary learning that I was speaking about. There's so many other components, blankets, clothes, the items and infrastructure to help repair those broken water systems. There's a lot that's got to happen, but look, we're really focused on those immediate basic needs of children in the early days, and then from there, those longer term rehabilitation and rebuilding efforts, should the ceasefire hold, which is our hope.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Tess Ingram, spokesperson for UNICEF. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Now, the outgoing US President Joe Biden last night delivered his farewell speech from the Oval Office. While drawing a line under a political career that spanned half a century, President Biden reflected on his 4 years in office, highlighting job creation and leading the United States as it emerged from the pandemic as being some of the highlights. He also said that the full impact of his administration would be seen and felt later on, saying that the seeds had been planted. However, he also warned of what he said were some of the dangers that lie ahead for the United States. Well, let's bring into the conversation Mo Vela, former Chief of Staff to President Biden, who joins us now from Miami. Mo, great to have you with us here once again on Al Arabiya News. I'd just like to start by picking up on what we've been talking about earlier in the programme, which is the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. It seems like there's a bit of a tug of war as to who deserves the credit for having achieved that. Would you say this is a credit to the outgoing administration or the incoming administration?
You know, it's absolutely a credit to the outgoing administration. They've been working on this ceasefire deal for months, as we all know. Everybody in the world knows that. But here's what I think is important right now. I don't think it's a time to be going back and forth and politicizing such an incredible milestone and monumental moment for peace. And you know what? My understanding is that one of Mr. Trump's representatives was present and involved in some of these last negotiations as part with the Biden team. And you know what? I think we rise above politics right now and give them both credit if that is due. But to try to say that the Biden administration shouldn't get credit is ridiculous. And I just think it's a waste of time and petty. They deserve credit. Anybody else who helped, if that includes Mr. Trump's team, they deserve credit. But the most important thing, Tom, is let's focus on the good that's going to come from that for the Israeli people and for the Palestinian people.
Thanks. And obviously the thrust of last night's 15-minute address was to really reflect on 4 years in office and also a 50-year-long political career. Some analysts, though, saying that 15-minute address was was a little bit dark in places. Do you agree with that?
You know, I think that I think it reflected, Tom, to be honest with you, the serious and honest and sincere concerns of President Biden. I just think he was being honest and real and transparent with what his fears and concerns are for our democracy and for our nation. But I think 50 plus years he dedicated to our nation. So our nation, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or a Libertarian, you're white, yellow, pink, green, or what, brown. It doesn't matter what any red state, blue state, Tom, doesn't matter. We owe this man an incredible debt of gratitude. So does other people around the world. He dedicated his entire life to our nation and to democracy and to peace. And so I didn't think it was dark. I thought it was simply realistic from his perspective. But overall, I thought it was his normal, kind and gracious and decent self.
I mean, he did warn, didn't he, of a dangerous oligarchy, he called it, being formed under the next administration, told Americans to stand guard. I'm not sure what you read into what Americans are supposed to do. But he talked about this oligarchy and its extreme wealth, power and influence, which he says threatens democracy, basic rights and freedoms. I mean, it sounded like he was basically taking aim at Elon Musk.
Well, it's extremely possible that he might have been referencing Mr. Musk, but there are other very wealthy people involved, as we all know. But look, I don't necessarily agree with the president on that. I still am at a place now, Tom, where I think I'm just sitting back and I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. This new administration, I want to see what they plan to do and what they're able to accomplish. If in fact it's positive and it furthers our democracy. In fact, if they do create a situation here in the United States that improves the lives of all Americans, not just some, that's going to be the key question to watch. If they continue to improve our relations with other countries around the world, there will be a lot of things we're all going to be watching for. So I'm hopeful, but cautious is a good word. We've heard a lot of bluster the last couple of years, if not the last 6 or 7 or 8 years, for that matter, coming from Mr. Trump. But I'm hoping it was just that, Tom, and I hope he gets down to business and just really does focus on making our lives a little better here in the United States.
Looking back at President Biden's 4 years in office, he said that some of the benefits of his time in office will take some time to see or feel. He said the seeds are planted. I mean, not very clear. I mean, it's a little bit on the vague side there. But what would you say just were the concrete achievements of these last 4 years?
Well, I'll give you a real life personal example. When I was the chief financial officer and senior advisor to Vice President Al Gore, when I was the director of management and senior advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden is what I meant. We had the American Recovery Act, as you might recall. And that was actually headquartered in Vice President Biden's office. I watched him and that team work on that. We are still feeling the impact and effects of that American Recovery Act in the way that those monies and funds were appropriated around the United States in all kinds of projects, Tom. And that's what he's referencing from his infrastructure bill, for example, and legislation. Those funds will be invested all over America, and sometimes you won't see the fruits of that labor for years to come, whether it's a bridge because they take years to build, or a highway, or all kinds of infrastructure projects, improving airports, ports. And so these projects, as you know, from an engineering perspective, can take a long time. They're very costly. So that's what he was referencing. We'll see the impact, the positive impact of his work for many years to come.
Okay, so what we've been looking at some of the things President Biden did do. One of the things he didn't do was to step out of the 2024 race in time to give another candidate a better shot at winning the election. And David Axelrod, I don't know if you know him, a former advisor to President Barack Obama, said, quote,
I do.
What he said is all Joe Biden wanted to be remembered for was the great things he did for this country. But at least in the short run, they've been eclipsed by his ill-conceived decision to run. And by that, he means to run again in the 2020 election. Mm-hmm. How damaging do you think that decision was by President Biden to his legacy?
I thought it was extremely damaging. I agree with David. That makes me and David not very popular among our peers, among some circles, but I agree with that assessment. I have been saying that for a long time. I thought that he should not have run for a second term. And to be honest with you, as I always am, I actually fault his senior advisors in that case, because I think that they did a disservice by encouraging him to run, Tom, and trying to convince him that the numbers looked good and that he, had a better chance than I think all the data was showing. And I thought it was unrealistic. And so I actually fault them as well. And I think history will always reflect that was an erroneous decision. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I know the Bidens well enough to say that I don't think it was an egotistical decision. I think he really, truly, in his heart, believes to this day that he was the only one that could continue to save our democracy as he did in the first time he won. And I think that was where he was coming from, Tom. But again, I also fault his advisors and his political advisors as well. And I thought it was a mistake. Yeah.
Just looking, you mentioned history, and I want to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit in just a moment. Mm-hmm. A CNN poll published yesterday gave President Biden a 36% approval rating, which is a bit better than Donald Trump's at 34% when he left office, much better than Richard Nixon's 24% when he left office, but still a long way off Bill Clinton's 66%, Barack Obama's 59%. Bottom line here is that President Biden is leaving office in the category of unpopular, I think it's fair to say, from that 36% approval rating. But do you believe that history will be kinder to him than an opinion poll that came out yesterday?
I do, actually. I saw that opinion poll. And again, I think we need to always keep in mind that there are a lot of people behind the scenes that probably deserve criticism much more than he does about those numbers. That I blame on, again, advisors, your communications team. I don't think they ever got their footing, Tom, from day one on messaging to the United States people and to the people around the world for that matter, but more importantly here in America. They never really were able to effectively communicate the things he was accomplishing as we went along. So you never really saw his poll numbers ever improve. And that's a sign of a bad communication system, a bad messaging system, and not, just bad advice, frankly. So, but I do, in spite of that, I really do believe, as he was referencing, that his initiatives will impact and improve America over time. I think that that's where history will reflect kindly on him. I don't think we can overlook one very, very vital thing. This man is a decent man. This man is a gracious and kind man, a compassionate man. And I think that history will always reflect that decency. And I think that will always be kind of the prevailing theme that he will always be remembered for, is that he always was striving for bipartisanship, always. Some of the greatest lessons I learned in my own life were working for him, when he and I had very strong conversations and personal conversations about how important it was to always strive to work in a bipartisan manner. And he meant it and he lived it. And so I think history will be kind to him. I really do.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to reflect on the Biden legacy with us. Mo Vela, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tom.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.